Great, thank you very much for this kind introduction and also for the invitation to come here. I really feel honored. It's also great being back in Ireland. So my last time in Ireland, it was part of my medical training actually. So I spent 4 months in a small hospital in Ballinasloe, which is towards Galway. It was the first and only time that I actually took out an inflamed appendix from a patient. Despite this positive experience, I actually didn't become a surgeon. So I'm a clinical epidemiologist, and I just wanted to briefly give you an impression of where I work. So Basel, it's not only a city, it's actually an area around the city in northwestern Switzerland. So right at the border to Germany, right at the border to France. And so I also want to disprove 2 cliches quickly. So one is, in Switzerland, mountains are everywhere. That's not true. Look at the picture. I mean, just these hills there behind. I mean, yeah, they are maybe as high as the Wicklow Mountains. The next cliche is that when I'm telling people that I'm a clinical researcher in Basel, then they typically ask, oh, you're working for Roche or Novartis. And no, I'm working at the University Hospital in Basel. And it does exist. So it is there. And there is academic clinical research in Basel too. So when I read the motto of the symposium, so partnering the pragmatism with complexity to achieve excellence. To achieve excellence, for me, this is primarily to increase value and to reduce waste. I mean, you know Ian Chalmers, you know Paul Glacier, and they came up with this sobering number of 85% of all biomedical research is waste. So how do we increase value? When we look at this value equation, then we can increase the value by increasing the quality of clinical research and or by decreasing the cost. And at the Department of Clinical Research at this university hospital, we were asking ourselves, okay, how do we increase the quality? Well, what does it mean to have high quality clinical research or high quality clinical trials? And then that started basically this project of increasing quality in academic clinical research, an INQUIRE project. So a PhD student of mine took that on and first conducted a systematic review on all kinds of definitions, frameworks, concepts on the quality of clinical research. So what does it mean? And so she not only searched websites from various stakeholders in different countries, but she also searched together with others then the public literature on that. And we found various different, or not many actually, 12 definitions, over 100 concepts out there, and the published literature was even less. So the conclusions from this was that quality of clinical research is often discussed, but in fact rarely defined. So when you want to get at the bottom of things, you're often left with ICH or Declaration of Helsinki. And another result was that what actually is quality varies depending on the stakeholder you're asking. So this is also no news really. But so we thought, okay, we really want to have a common basis, a common goal to strive for. So can't we develop a framework based on a consensus there, so that we use the results from the systematic review to combine it to a first initial structure of a quality framework. And we did 2 Delphi rounds with people from various countries, different stakeholder groups, just to make sure that we did not miss anything. And then we did 2 Delphi rounds, consensus rounds, where we explicitly invited also Swiss representatives, a considerable number from each of the relevant stakeholders, to come up with a consensus across stakeholders. And we termed it INQUIRE Framework. So how does it look like? Actually, so I can't show, is there any pointer? There's a mouse. No, doesn't show there. So we wanted to do something across the process to all stages of a clinical study or a clinical trial, actually. So from the concept to the planning, conduct, analysis, and so on. And we identified then these 6 domains. So the protection of patient safety and rights, of course, the relevance, patient-centeredness, and involvement. So innovation is also part of this. Minimization of bias, precision, transparency, access to data, and generalizability, so the external validity. So that was the core, basically, of the framework. And the left and the right, you can see 2 so-called promoters. So each of these promoters, so the infrastructure here to the left and sustainability and education to the right, are influencing each of these domains. So if you have a good, well-working, established infrastructure at your institution, this will basically promote or facilitate each of these domains. And if you're thinking about the training and education of young researchers or trial staff, I think this will also promote each of these domains. So how did we then operationalize it or try to operationalize it? So for each of these stages, so let's take this example of the concept stage, we then went through these 6 domains and the promoters and asked specific questions. So that's this middle row, and then we have some descriptive examples for each of these questions. So here, for example, it's about the concept stage. We have these different domains, and for the relevance part, for example, we can see that we are asking here about the add-on value to already existing evidence, whether there is then in more detail, we are asked, okay, is there a systematic review that was used to actually see what was already out there, and does the new research actually expand or challenge the current knowledge, or does it justify a replication? So just to make it explicit, so where the relevance lies really with the project. So having come up with this framework, we further asked then, okay, can we use that to measure or monitor quality of clinical trials in our department or also elsewhere? And we can derive actually various potential indicators of quality of clinical research from these frameworks. So for example, we can say that if trial protocols are more comprehensive, if they all include the important items that we could, for example, define through the SPIRIT guidelines, so the minimum content for a trial protocol, then maybe it's better planned research. Maybe this results in better trials. So as already mentioned by Dominic, so use of systematic reviews to justify and plan a new trial. Availability and the publication of trial protocols could be such an indicator. Prospective trial registration, of course, or trial completion, premature discontinuation. That's what we not want, actually. We want the trials to complete to their planned sample size. And the availability and the publication of the trial results. So this is definitely central for good quality clinical trials. So I will give you some examples here. So for the two that I just grade here, there we don't have results yet, so these projects are still ongoing. But for the others, I will try to show you some current data that we collected. And what we did was that we did empirical research on that. So research on clinical research. And there, of course, the patient is at the center of all our efforts and should be considered at all the stages of the research process. So from the study conception, planning and feasibility, conduct, analysis, and publication and dissemination of the results. And each of these steps has its challenges, and we want to evaluate also the methods that are used for each of these stages with the same scientific rigor as we evaluate basically therapeutic or preventive interventions. And we do this in various projects in our group, and I really don't want to tell you about all of those. So I focus on the ones that I had talked about earlier. So starting with the most relevant probably. So trial completion and availability of trial results. So if trial results are not available, it is basically as if the trial was never done, right? It was all in vain. So there are two projects that we did. So we called them DISCO projects from discontinued trials. DISCO 1 project I've presented already at several occasions, but the method is exactly the same that we are using also for DISCO 2 and probably DISCO 3. So what we did was that we looked at trial protocols that were approved by research ethics committees in the years 2000 to 2003. So that's the first cohort. And then, so after a period of 10 years, roughly, we looked for corresponding publications to these trial protocols. And we wanted to know whether these RCTs were actually completed as planned or whether they were discontinued for some of these reasons I listed here, and whether the RCT was actually published or not. And if we could not find this out from the publications that we were searching and from the files from the ethics committees, then we did a survey of the local investigators and asked them directly. We did this through the ethics committees, so that the presidents of the ethics committees would send out letters asking the investigators about the fate of their trial. And that led to a response rate of over 85% actually. We also did an analysis where we tried to identify factors like risk factors for trial discontinuation right from the protocol. But this analysis I will not talk about further in this talk. So the results here, trial discontinuation from this cohort, we looked at almost 900 RCT protocols, including patients. And as you can see, there are more than 25%, so more than 1 out of 4 RCTs was prematurely discontinued. And the most frequent reason was clearly slow recruitment of participants, followed by futility, administrative reasons, and so on. What about publication then? So looking at the completed trials, it becomes clear that a bit over 70% were actually published in peer-reviewed journals. But more than 20% were not published at all, in no way. And these were completed. So with discontinued trials, it's clearly worse. So most of the discontinued trials were not published at all. So we just don't know what happened there. We also had a look at RCT protocols, or in this case, proposals that were funded by the National Funding Agency in Switzerland. So they have on their website also that they focus also on feasibility in their evaluation, and they promote also excellence, of course. And so they collaborated with us, which was great, and we could then look at all the RCT proposals that were funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation between 1986 and 2015, basically. So there are not too many, actually just 101. And the results you can see here. So it is really like a déjà vu. So it doesn't make really a difference whether these RCT proposals or protocols went through a competitive process and had reviewers looking at feasibility issues. There were just as many RCTs that were prematurely discontinued, actually. And all of these, 26, were discontinued for slow recruitment. So 10 years later, so imagine now a trial cohort or ICT protocols that were approved in the year 2012. So here we included again Switzerland. So actually all research ethics committees in Switzerland, we only have 7. And we had an ethics committee from the UK who collaborated with us in Oxford, and an ethics committee in Canada and one in Germany. And there we only took a random sample of RCTs. In Switzerland, it's actually the total. So we took all the RCTs that were approved in that year. And we just subdivided the main RCTs and pilot RCTs that were already labeled as pilot RCTs. So let's focus on the main RCTs. What happened to them from the year 2012? So 10 years after DISCO 1, basically. And the picture looks very similar again. So 25% of RCTs that have been started were prematurely discontinued. And we haven't done the survey yet, so this number can even get worse. So for some, we don't know yet whether they were not discontinued. And the main reason, again, is slow recruitment. Of course, what else? Futility, administrative reasons. It looks very similar to what we have found already in the year 2002, basically. And when we now look at the availability of results, it's again very similar. So 2012, so we just received these findings basically, or collected the data. 7 years after the approval, we checked whether they were published in any format, any source, and for about 30%, we could not find any results published anywhere. So we looked, of course, also in the trial registries, and about 45% we could find results published in a registry. As a full-text publication, 62%, and that it was actually published in a registry and the full-text publication, that was only the case in 35%. So if we stratify by industry-sponsored trials and academic trials or non-industry trials, we see that industry trials look much better, and this has changed from 10 years ago. There, it was the other way around. We still had this image of the industry not publishing all the trials. I mean, they're still not publishing all their trials, but in comparison to academic trials, it looks much better. So almost 90%. And for the academic trials, it looks actually worse, so 50%. If we look at the registries, I mean, this is something that is still, or there is some dynamic there, I think. And again, industry-sponsored trials are with 76%, you can find results in there. So for academic investigators, it's only 10%, actually. If you look at it across countries, so Switzerland, UK, Germany, Canada, based on our sample that we have, it looks not much different. So if you just focus on the bottom line there, it's 31%, Switzerland, UK 28%, Germany 24%, Canada 33%. So a lot of research where patients contribute, where they're part of it, is just wasted. So going to the next item, comprehensiveness of trial protocols. So this is the ASPIRE project, we call it Adherence to Spirit Recommendations. So most of you have probably heard of the Spirit checklist or Spirit recommendations. So a 33-item checklist containing the minimum content of a trial protocol. And this was published in 2013. So a good trial protocol should mention these items. In addition to this event that Spirit was published, in Switzerland actually there was a new law coming into force, the Swiss Human Research Act. It's a new legislation that impacted human research in Switzerland quite a bit, also leading to template, for example, provided by Swiss Ethics for researchers that the protocols are better structured. And so we wanted to know, okay, is there any difference measurable before, after? So it's this comparison, RCT protocols from 2012 versus RCT protocols from 2016. So before Spirit, before the new Swiss law, and 2016 afterwards. So these box plots here show on the left that you have, again, stratified non-industry, industry, that industry starts out basically with a higher level of reported Spirit items. So the proportion of reported Spirit items is larger. But it also didn't really change over time. So from 2012 to 2016, there is basically no difference. For the non-industry protocols, however, there is a change. There is an increase from about 60% to, let's say, 74%. So here's the detailed data. Sorry, it's a bit small and difficult for you to read. So if you look at all protocols, there is not much of a difference. And if you look at industry protocols, so this is again just the proportion of items of the Spirit checklist that were adequately reported. And industry is close to 80%. And again, in 2016, it's also close to 80%. So the non-industry funded RCT protocols, they start out 2012 with about 65%, and there's an increase of about 11%. So is this relevant, we asked ourselves? Or is this just an improvement in some items that are just some administrative items? No, it's really an improvement in 23 items, basically, by more than 10%. So that's some positive news. What about prospective trial registration then, 2012, 2016? So here we see that all of the protocols that we looked at in 2012, there was a registration rate of 91%. If we look at it stratified industry versus non-industry, there is again some difference. So industry protocols are pretty much registered, 96%. Non-industry protocols, however, remain at 86%. So still 15% that is missing. And if we again look at it across countries, so the bottom 3 lines, then we see also that it is relatively comparable across countries. So there are only small samples in Germany and Canada. Maybe that's why they look a bit better. And if we specifically look at prospective trial registration, then we see it's on average about 10% less than being registered at all. So I finished these slides relatively last minute. So I wanted to show you also then the registration rates for 2016, but I couldn't find them on my computer anymore. So basically there's no change, okay? So this is not very evidence-based, but please trust me. Yeah. So what else do we want to do with these RCT protocols and that data? I mean, we want to see to what extent actually non-published RCTs can be found in registries. I mean, that's the a major advantage of registries now. That's one of their main purposes, that all trials can be identified. But if not all trials are registered, still there is the possibility that a significant number of trials are going to be missed, also for systematic reviews. And we want to investigate the consistency of RCT information across trial registries. Many trials are registered in various registries, but typically investigators only update one registry. So maybe information in other registries is outdated then. And we want to know whether the comprehensiveness of a trial protocol is in any way associated with the trial conduct, or let's say whether a trial is completed or whether it was discontinued, and whether also the quality of the protocol can say anything about whether it will be published, the RCT, in the end or not. So in 2023, we will look at the 2016 cohort, so RCT protocols that were approved in 2016, and then we can compare it to DISCO 2 and DISCO 1, basically. And we will call this, of course, DISCO 3. So let's look now at the cost aspect. So I talked about quality. What about the cost then? How much is a clinical trial? Which leads us to the MARTA project, so making randomized trials more affordable, we thought might be a good title for that. So how much is an RCT? I thought that's a simple question in the beginning, and everyone has estimates for that, clinical trial units, experienced investigators, but I thought, yeah, there is also a lot probably in the literature. But then with a quick and dirty search, I couldn't find much, and then we thought, okay, let's look at this systematically, do a proper systematic review, and we looked at various databases, so Medline, Embase, HealthStar, and make the long story short, we found exactly 0 articles that reported the data on resource use and costs for all the aspects, for the whole process of an RCT. So starting with the planning, conduct, analysis, and so on. So there were estimates for the total costs of the trial, but typically the authors didn't really tell us where these estimates came from, what was considered to be part of the resource use for a clinical trial, what was left out. And also we found various articles about costs for recruitment, different recruitment strategies, but not an entire RCT. So one reaction was that we wanted to see if it can be done at all. And we did this then with 2 RCTs that we had at hand, where we were involved in the past. And we constructed first a comprehensive cost item list that we also circulated among various experts, and they added items, and we discussed, okay, what is really then comprehensive in the end, and used this on a randomized trial looking at adjunct corticosteroids for community-acquired pneumonia, which was conducted in 7 Swiss hospitals, 2009, 2014, 800 participants, the planned budget 1.5 million, and the planned time 3.5 years for recruitment and follow-up. So the main outcome was, I think, follow-up of 30 days after randomization. And typically, the recruitment took longer than we thought, so it took 5 years, and the total costs were in the end 2.4 million. Just to take a very different second trial that a postdoc of mine coordinated during his PhD. So 2 schools at Pemba Island, Tanzania, 480 school children with worm infections, 4 different treatments for worm infections, and the planned time for the recruitment and also the just for the trial in 2 months basically, and it actually took only 2 months, and it only cost 100,000 Swiss francs at the time. So we saw, okay, it is possible. So somehow it is just cumbersome, and then costs for RCTs can be collected retrospectively. We were also interested then in what are the hidden costs in RCTs. So the preparation costs to write the protocol, to come up with a proposal. These are typically resources that you could get never reimbursed for, and at least for academic trials. And so we thought we could just use the RCT protocols from our 2012 cohort and 2016 cohort and send surveys to these investigators. And they would tell us what their trials costed, or the preparation time they needed, and also then the costs that were involved here. But it turned out that this is not a good way to collect data. So as you can see, for the 2012 cohort, only 19 investigators actually participated in our survey. For 2016, which is a bit more recent, it were 47, but out of several hundreds. So people don't like to talk about money. People don't like to talk about costs of their trials. And therefore, our estimates are very shaky. So sorry about this crowded slide. So the first line just says protocol or forms, how much that cost in a trial. And so it was between 30,000 and 40,000 Swiss francs, basically. So we wanted then to see, okay, there are other types of trials out there which could be much cheaper. So if we use new technologies, if we use electronic health records, we had a look at these trials actually, and then came up with estimates here, costs per patient, sometimes only $44 or $315. It also depended whether the electronic health record source was already implemented somewhere, and the intervention was integrated during routine care. So these aspects probably played an important role. So I'll skip over this here. That was also looking at budgeting tools then. What is out there? Is there anything validated? Not really. So out of these 25 tools that we found to come up with an RCT budget that are available somewhere, only one had evidence for validation or that it was user tested. So further plans here are that we want to have ways to cost data can be transparently collected and shared maybe, so that we just know how much things are. And it would be great to have some sort of a reference database. We need to better understand cost structures, so how much of the percent of the total budget is used, for example, for the recruitment or the preparation costs. We need to identify cost drivers, so explore interventions and a stakeholder consensus and user-tested budgeting tools. And what we also look at right now is costs for placebos and investigational medical products in academic trials. So I will not talk about SWOTs, but these are also a great means of increasing the value of RCTs. The experts are here in the room. So I just want to, at the end, mention how we are going to use these results basically from this methods research. And so integrate it into the teaching and, of course, also in the different services that clinical trial units often provide. And in this consulting process, I think, there are then problems, questions that come up that trigger, again, research on research projects. And the results should also be fed into networks, so like this one here in Ireland. We recently founded the STEAM working group for Switzerland, so that just a few people actually who are interested and do meta research come together, exchange, and stimulate each other. There is TrialForge. BASEL has become a Swiss branch of TrialForge, and there are projects, EU projects like Cost Action, and so I'm, for example, involved in Cost Action on evidence-based clinical research, which is also, I think, a great idea to move forward with better quality for clinical research. So we need common goals across stakeholders. We need measurable indicators, and this empirical evidence is a prerequisite for improvement. So far, however, little improvement I think we can see over time, and more empirical research is needed to inform evidence-based clinical research, and collaboration is absolutely crucial. So across stakeholders, but definitely also across borders, that methods researchers work together. So I'm very grateful to all these people, and I would like to thank you for your attention.